New Year on a working day as well. I mean, all of you have managed to take time off to be here with us. Thank you so much for that. Um, I'm going to sort of say a few words about what you see out there, which is conversations in policy and development. Um, like, like it reads, really, it's just an attempt that the institution I represent, Athena Infonomics, initiated just about 4 months ago. And the initiative is simply, it's a very simple attempt at doing precisely that, promoting conversations on matters of public interest and doing it here in Chennai, because we discovered that not enough of it happens here in Chennai. We've been very fortunate to have some very distinguished people participate and speak on this platform, like the editor of Business Standard and the program head of the World Bank for Poverty. And we also have with us today some very senior distinguished people to share insights, perspectives that we don't generally get to sort of read or hear about in the public domain very easily. We've also been very fortunate to sort of have like-minded organizations and associations come forward to support and take this initiative. We began in really a very small way forward, because simply an audience such as this will, we simply would not have had the opportunity to interact with an audience such as this if not for organizations like the Madras Chamber. Thank you so very much. And the Madras School of Economics, of course, needs no mention. It's as an institution, I think it has done so much to put economics at the forefront, particularly in the South, because when I did my bachelor's in economics, my father had pretty much written off any possibility of me having a career opportunity. And when such a strong stigma exists, I think institutions like the Madras School has done wonderful things for students aspiring to do serious work in the field of economics. We're also very grateful to the Madras School of Economics for having joined hands with us to take this particular event forward. We have here with us the president of the Madras Chamber. I'd also like to call upon him to say a few words, after which I shall carry forward the onerous task of introducing all of the distinguished experts that we have with us today. Over to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think it gives me great pleasure to stand before you all and introduce about the chamber, which most of you might not have heard about it, because you all belong to the academics, I guess, and research. I see in the back rows. The Madras Chamber is the oldest in the country as a Chamber of Commerce and Industry. I can say that along with Bombay Chamber of Commerce. It's just 178 years old. And we do have quite a few members of our chamber here. And as was mentioned earlier, I think it's the first day, Monday, and starting at a time 5 o'clock. Finding this place is a little bit of a maze, I would say, but still we have made to come in here. And I think the interesting part is about the free trade agreements and what really the industry can do, or what the industry should do about it, business and industry. I frankly have to admit that while chambers like ours, the Madras Chamber, we could have done a lot more as industry, as business. We should have taken advantage of the FTAs that have been signed by the government. What I understand is about 15 agreements have already been signed and 15 are in the pipeline. And one of the important ones is with ASEAN. I think for goods it was signed in 2010, and for services and investments it was signed in 2012. We don't seem to have taken advantage of the FTAs, and I'm sure that we are going to hear a lot about what have been done by the government, what has been done by the industry, and where we are lagging. And I think we should pick up threads from here and then start working towards at least achieving what we can really achieve with the FTAs that the government has signed up. Thank you very much for allowing me to introduce the Madras Chamber.
I'd like to invite the speakers for today's discussion onto the dais, please. Dr. Amitendu, Mr. M.R. Venkatesh, and Mr. Arijit Datta Chaudhary. So we really do have a fairly interesting panel here today, this evening, because the speakers who you see here sitting in front of you come from very different backgrounds and are sort of going to present very diverse perspectives in a way that's influenced deeply by the sort of experience and backgrounds that they come from. The first is really what I'm going to say is more from the government side. We have Dr. Amitendra Palit. We have the honor of having Dr. Amitendra Palit here with us today, who's had over a decade of experience with the Ministry of Finance and is Senior Visiting Fellow and Research Lead Economics and Trade at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Just those two things, I think, will present, that experience will present, like I said earlier, insights that we simply don't get to read off in the newspapers, which is what really are the motives behind the FTAs that get signed. What are some of, therefore, the characteristics of these FTAs and the issues thereof which arise from them? And Dr. Palit will present his perspective on this. On the business side of the story, we again have two very interesting speakers with us today. Mr. M.R. Venkatesh, I think, needs no introduction to this audience, is someone that all of us at the Madras Chamber particularly are very familiar with. A renowned chartered accountant, Mr. Venkatesh is a popular commentator in a number of the popular print and electronic media, and he advises businesses extensively on matters of trade and strategy. We also have with us Mr. Arijit Datta Chowdhury, who is the head of business for Africa at Ashok Leyland and has been responsible for developing Ashok Leyland's infrastructure in that region. They are going to perhaps present the other side of the story, like Mr. Prabhakar said, what businesses should and must do to really leverage the FTAs and really reap the gains that come from some of the things that's being signed and done. Without further ado, Dr. Palit, over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, and it's twilight, so good evening to all of you as well. It's a pleasure to be here in Chennai, and I can already spot familiar faces. Thanks very much to my good friends Vijay and Deepa again, and of course Athena, Dr. Narayan. I will not probably sort of spend too much time on the larger context of what I'm going to speak, but I would love to share with you one of the reasons why I picked up this subject. One is, of course, the fact that I have been looking at this area of India's engagement in regional trade agreements and free trade agreements for some time. But it's also an outcome of a few discussions that I have had over the last 1 to 1.5 years with India's Ministry of Commerce at different levels, where some of you might be aware of that over the last couple of years there's been an extensive review going on of the various free trade agreements that India has signed. And that review is yet to be finished. There are some rather interesting conclusions coming out of those review, which I will reflect upon. But I think we as a country in 2015 are at a stage where time has come for us to take a close look at the way how we engage with the rest of the world in terms of our best commercial interests. And I was actually quite encouraged to hear the President mention about the FTAs and the fact that industry could have, should have been a more active part of those agreements. Well, having been in the government, it's easy to put the ball back in industry's court, but there are probably equivalent amount of compulsions, constraints, or lack of understanding on sides of both stakeholders to take this forward. So, let me just begin with a little background on India's FTA negotiations. All this began from the early years of the current century. So we have basically been around 10, 12 years old in the FTA game. And this is pretty young by international standards because there are countries which have been negotiating regional agreements and bilateral agreements well before the WTO was there, while the WTO was being negotiated, and even after the WTO came in. So all this kind of went on concurrently. And now we suddenly find that while we started from early 2000, we are now engaging with more than taking all the groups together. We probably now have negotiations with almost 50 countries of the world, taken individually. And they include a variety of countries, beginning from the least developed countries to a variety of emerging markets, developed countries, Southeast Asian countries, Latin American countries, African countries, not to talk about the South Asian neighborhood. We began with small bilateral agreements. I say small because these really had very limited scope. And if we look at the natures of the FTAs that are now signed across the world between countries, and if we compare those with what India signed in the early days, maybe with Thailand or with Chile, then we actually see that the scope of these Indian FTAs were very, very limited in terms of the preferential access which they offer on either side. And the early FTAs had almost exclusive focus on tariffs. Well, tariffs have been a very major part of India's trade negotiations with the rest of the world. But if you now look at the international trade discourse, particularly the one coming out of Asia Pacific and even elsewhere, and even at the WTO, tariffs are the least discussed subject. The focus has completely shifted to non-tariff issues, including standards, rules of origin, investment, services, competition policy, and so on and so forth. But in the Indian context, we still debate tariffs, maybe for obvious reasons, but this was also one of the features of India's early FTAs. These FTAs have become comprehensive over time. So now the new generation FTAs that we have, the ones that have been signed over the last 4 to 5 years, including the one with ASEAN, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, all these reflect a greater coverage and scope. Why have we been into the FTA game? Now, let's not forget that India as a country has been at a confusion when it comes to articulating a foreign trade policy. There have been several nuances governing the articulation of a foreign trade policy, and India has been kind of trapped on one side in terms of its commitment to multilateralism and the WTO, which arguably is probably the most superior form of trading arrangement that can emerge in the world. But at the same time, when it realizes along with a host of other countries in the world that the WTO just doesn't move forward and it takes 12 years, 12 years and a Bali and then post-Bali, and we haven't yet seen the post of post-Bali, to get actually not even a fraction of what the Doha Development Agenda promised in 2003, then one can understand the frustrations that are building up across the world, including in a country like India, which suddenly realized that there are other countries, emerging markets like China, Japan, Korea, Brazil at that point in time, now no more, Chile, Australia, New Zealand, everybody are aggressively getting into bilateral agreements across the world. And the reason is very simple. Since the multilateral agreement is not producing results, it's the bilateral agreements and the regional agreements which are left for obtaining the desired levels of preferential access into country markets. Now, also at the same time, I think there was this realization that beginning from 2001, 2002, 2003 onward, that the early years of the current century were actually very, very significant years when one looks back at the trajectory of India's external sector reforms. And by external sector reforms, I'm not referring to the balance of payment issues. I'm basically referring to reforms which relate to transformation of institutions that deal externally with other countries, including the foreign investment regime and the foreign exchange management regime, which were implemented in the early years of the current century. And at that time, there was also this thinking that it is time for India now, with this backup and threshold having achieved, to take a positive look at its trade engagement with the rest of the world and start exploring bilateral FTAs. So one of the starting points for the larger modern bilateral FTA engagement taken up by India was actually in 2003 when India agreed to work on a comprehensive economic framework cooperation agreement with ASEAN. The result of which has been 2 agreements with ASEAN that has been signed, first on goods and second on services and investment. And at the same time, we gradually saw that India also becoming active in trying to position itself as a country which can slowly emerge as a hub in a number of hub and spoke commercial business engagement patterns that are shaping in the region. Needless to say, again, to an extent, this would have been inspired by the Korean or the Japanese fashions that were happening at that point in time, with the value chains beginning to emerge distinctly and the regional production networks taking shape. Now, if these were the motives, and if we sort of kind of live ourselves with the motives at this point in time, we see the outcome. And the outcome, if you plain and simply look at the outcome document, I think if you take out completely externally oriented countries, Singapore and Chile apart, because for these countries, the trade GDP ratio is enormous. They have almost 450% to 500% trade GDP ratios. And their GDPs are completely dependent upon the external commerce vis-a-vis the rest of the world. If we take out those kind of countries, and if we look at countries, emerging markets with fairly large domestic economies, India is clearly one of the most active FTA sort of engagers, if we can put it that way. So you have 16 FTAs that are already concluded and signed, and they have been called by various names, irrespective of whether they are actually roses or not. So we started with PTAs, which are known as the preferential trade agreements. We upgraded ourselves to free trade agreements, and then we started signing CECAs, which are comprehensive economic cooperation agreements, which have now been phased out by CEPAs, comprehensive economic partnership agreements. This itself is a cause for enormous confusion. I mean, honestly speaking, if there is a FAQ put up on India's FTAs, what is the difference between PTA, FTA, CECA, CEPA? I don't think you will find the answer. And that itself is a subject of research in certain respects. And then you have the South Asian Free Trade Agreement. You have an India-Africa Trade Agreement. I mean, somebody like me who has been dabbling and mudding my fingers in RTS for 4 years, I myself wasn't aware of number 15 till I committed to Vijay that I'll be making this presentation. So when I look into the archives, I saw that India actually has an agreement with 19 countries in Africa, which again, narrow agreements, but nonetheless they exist. And if you now sort of leave this aside and come to the right-hand sort of column, which is the other box, and if you look at the agreements that are being negotiated, you'd actually discover here that India is engaging with, on a trade basis, with practically countries in all parts of the world. You have the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is a group that, that builds up on the ASEAN FTAs. It sort of has ASEAN as its core, the 10-member Southeast Asian community, and the countries with whom the ASEAN has signed bilateral agreements. So this includes India, Australia, China, Korea, Japan, and New Zealand. So there are 16 countries in that. That covers the almost the most important part of Asia Pacific in terms of the Asian side. You have the EU, which itself represents 27 countries on one side. You have Australia, Canada, India's first foray into the North American market in terms of engagement, the Canada FTA, and which is incidentally at a fairly advanced stage. You have one with New Zealand FTA, and the interesting part is that India has gone back to the FTAs that it signed with Chile and Thailand and Mercosur group of countries in an effort to upgrade them. Now, really that doesn't leave any part of the world untouched, so as to say, except probably you could say that the Gulf countries with whom India hasn't gone into FTAs. But there are distinct possibilities because the GIC countries, the GCC countries are also countries with whom feasibility studies have been conducted. And in this, I haven't included the countries with whom the feasibility studies have been conducted and finished, one of whom is, of course, Indonesia. Now, if we sort of step behind the story now, and there's this huge sort of exhaustive level of engagement, pan-geography, across regions, across the world, what are we signing? What are we negotiating? What are we ending up with? And this is where, let me take this story a little back to give you the context, that India is still a country which doesn't have more than 1.5% share in global trade. Now, technically speaking, to an ignorant observer, all these FTAs and RTAs should have led to an increase in India's share in global trade. That hasn't happened. It doesn't show much sign of happening, unfortunately. But we keep on signing RTAs and we keep on signing FTAs. In hope, we all live on hope, so we are living on hope here as well. Why isn't this happening? What is the problem with our RTAs and FTAs that we have signed? Now, the first point is that our agreements, unfortunately, are not really modern agreements. Our agreements are very narrow in their scope. The problem is that on most occasions, we haven't been willing partners into these agreements. We have kind of been into them by default. At least for most of the early FTAs, this is what had happened when the strategic motive or the foreign policy motive for engaging in FTAs was the primary motive. And then an economic rationale was actually sought to be found out without thinking how much of economic benefits are actually there in that agreement. Let's say an agreement with Nepal. What does India stand to gain out of it? Purely in terms of long-term agreement. I mean, just putting it as a hypothetical example, or an agreement with Afghanistan. What are the clear benefits that India can obtain out of this? And secondly, since you really don't have an economic rationale well developed, what you end up arguing with or negotiating with or sort of eyeing from these agreements are purely the fact that there should be an agreement on a piece of paper which would show to the rest of the world that India has a free trade agreement with this country, which should primarily act as a confidence building measure from a strategic perspective. It really doesn't matter whether it's an economically winsome agreement, so keep the coverage low and just tinker with some tariffs at the 8-digit level in whatever ways you can. In fact, India is not the only country which does this. There are other countries which do this, and just to take you aside for a second, there are these least developed countries across the world, more than 50 countries, which enjoy preferential access into the developed country markets, including Indian and Chinese markets. And the funny part is that if you talk to the least developed countries, they will say that, but those tariffs, those zero tariffs are not given on our exports of comparative interest. Those are given on items on which we don't have any comparative advantage at all. But on paper, India and China would claim that, yes, we give complete duty-free access to LDC, so we are champions of the poor in the world. Anyway, so focus mostly on tariffs with limited coverage of tariff lines. I mean, under normal circumstances, you have, comparably speaking, if you look at the ASEAN FTAs, what the Southeast Asian countries have signed, this now is coming back to haunt India because India concluded a goods FTA with ASEAN 4 years ago. The tariff coverage under that goods FTA, after enormous negotiations, is 77.3%. Whereas the average of tariff coverage in other FTAs that ASEAN has signed is more than 90%. Now, this has come back to haunt India in their RCEP negotiations, because these RCEP negotiations involve all countries with whom ASEAN has these FTAs. So obviously now one of these FTAs will be picked up as a base. So for India, it's a case like getting into a soccer match with 2 goals down. You have fixed yourself at 77% tariff coverage, whereas the others are already at 92%. So first you have to match up to the base. And then only you can think of any further incremental coverage at any level, whether that is at all obtainable or not. The shallow depth, again, another critical factor. The problem is that, I think it's very important from a policymaker's perspective now to realize the fact that there are, of course, defensive interests involved. There are sectors in India which have strong defensive interests. There's no question of sort of compromising with those defensive interests given the situation on the ground. But at the end of the day, it's important to understand what is the other party wanting. There's no point in getting into a negotiation just for defending oneself. There has to be a forward-looking agenda. There has to be some opportunity, some schedule that India must look for in obtaining this. What are these? Our traditional ground has been export of Mode 4, temporary professionals. Now, temporary professionals are fine, but are we prepared to allow entry of temporary movement of professionals in our country? The easiest country which this could have been done is, of course, Singapore. Not a single mutual recognition agreement under the India-Singapore SECA has been signed till now. And if you can't do that with a country like Singapore, which arguably has the most easy sort of rules for doing business and so on and so forth, there's very little possibility of doing it with other countries of the world, because in other countries of the world won't lower their guard in this respect, much as we won't. It's a clear turf, well defined. So Mode 4 is not the issue. We need to move well beyond temporary movement of professionals to identify where actually can we gain from the various free trade agreements, and that's where we probably need to move into the terrain of investments, services, and actually look at issues which are affecting our exports. To give you another simple example, tariffs come down. Let's say the India-Malaysia SECA brings down tariffs on a number of items, but still Indian exports don't happen. Why? Two reasons. One, Indian exporters don't use the India-Malaysia SECA, and I'll come to that, why they don't. Second, tariffs might have come down, but quality standards remain. So it really doesn't make any difference whether on paper Malaysia today goes around claiming that, you know, we have given liberal tariff concessions to export of auto components from India, as long as there is a mismatch with the level of standards in terms of the certification requirements of the domestic sort of economy. Indian exports, much as other country exports, are not going to get access into Malaysia. And this was just another hypothetical example. The third point is that countries across the world, and if you look at emerging markets, Brazil is a completely different case altogether, because Brazil has probably reversed its trajectory of external engagement. But if you look at other emerging markets, the focus and feature of these emerging markets, and the most striking example is China, that they have actually moved on to issues which have been controversial in the WTO. And these controversial issues are increasingly getting figured in the regional trade agreements across the world, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and so on and so forth. And these issues mostly relate to intellectual property, services, government procurement, competition policy, the relationship between trade and labor standards, and so on and so forth. Indian negotiations have actually completely avoided this. Now, the fact of the matter is, it's not the question of whether we should discuss this, but the important question is, when these come up for discussion, what should be our position? Because these are inevitably going to come up for discussion when there is a large bunch of countries involved. We at least need to have a clear view on this. Are we prepared to discuss this? Are we prepared to talk on this? Are we prepared to block this out? Because regional trade agreements, unlike WTO, do not offer flexibilities. In WTO's, consensus is the bottom line. If there's no consensus, WTO doesn't move. Regional trade agreements, no consensus, they're prepared to go ahead, even with dissent. Next. One of the sort of points that this initial reports and reviews by the government on the existing FTAs have brought to light is the fact that they're hardly used by the domestic industry. And the usage rates are somewhere around 15 to 17% on an average of the existing FTAs. Now, this is not to say that domestic industry is committing a great crime by not using the FTAs, but it certainly points to the fact that the FTAs remain underutilized. And why is it so? Well, there are two obvious reasons. First, if I had been in industry, my point would have been, which FTA should I use? If, let us say, I'm exporting to Thailand, I have an India-Thailand FTA, I have an India-ASEAN FTA which covers Thailand. I also have an Asia-Pacific trade agreement which includes Thailand. I am negotiating something with BIMSTEC. I am into RCEP. Which agreement should I use? Look at Singapore. Which one do you use? You also have a bilateral with Singapore. for Malaysia, which one do you use? Do you use the India-ASEAN SICA or the India-Malaysia SICA? This is where government dissemination has been abysmal. There has been no effort on part of the government agencies to actually explain to the stakeholders that what are the benefits of individual FTAs, why does one FTA need to be distinguished from another, and why should industry take a call on using this? Because even today, more than 60% of trade in India, or almost 70%, takes place through the MFN route. These are not through the FTA routes. The second problem, for Indian industry, again, FTAs are complicated. And I fully agree with the fact that FTAs are complicated because given a choice, nobody would use these complicated instruments given the caveats which they put in. One simple example is something called the rules of origin. Rules of origin put down that in order to obtain the preferential tariff in the country of import, the exporting country must show that that product has originated within itself. So that's the last place of transportation. And there are various norms for satisfying this. One is the value addition norm, the other is the certificate of transformation of origin. Indian FTAs are the only FTAs which actually insist on simultaneous satisfaction of various conditions. And I don't really know what's the rationale for having put this over there, but they are there and left to themselves. Who would use this, given the opportunity costs of using this? There are, of course, as we mentioned, too much of emphasis on tariffs. The problem is that if negotiations become completely focused on tariffs from the Indian side, the focus dilutes elsewhere. And that's probably where the concentration and the efforts flag. So it becomes a kind of a quid pro quo that if we concede on tariffs, we need to obtain something else somewhere. Well, what is that somewhere and where is that somewhere? We don't know what we are wanting, but we know what we shouldn't give. This is actually kind of a counterproductive situation. And there are certain major fundamental constructs that have now occupied negotiators, trade negotiators across the world, something like value chains. Till now, Indian negotiations have not been built up on the concept of value chains. Because what the negotiations would have done, had they focused on value chains, is the fact that the emphasis would not have been only on the final product. The emphasis would have been equally strong on intermediates. Today in India, we face a situation where we often encounter an inverted duty structure, where the import duty on the intermediates is actually more than the import duty on the finished products. But for intermediate users, this could be a very complicated scenario. And even there could be exporters of intermediates with considerable comparative advantage in the region of value chain markets. So, strategic compulsions, not economic, one of the factors affecting early FTAs, not that it has completely gone away today. We actually need to prioritize, because this trade policy division in the Ministry of Commerce, which handles all negotiations, is a team of 12 people. And it simultaneously negotiates with all countries of the world, as we saw over there, RTAs, bilaterals, and let's not forget the mother of all them, the WTO. What exactly are we trying to achieve? Which is our priority? Where should we focus more? Because we can't stretch our resources too thin. And there's hardly been any involvement of non-government agencies in negotiations. Why is that the scenario? Why aren't professionals, civil society holders, and the rest of them taken into a forum of discussion for preparing position papers when it comes to negotiations? Because at the end of the day, the problem probably lies in the fact that we still don't consider external trade engagement as a key priority. It comes as a bit of a residual. And if we do consider it as a key priority, as a national interest, then we need to handle it accordingly. It should get the importance it deserves. in terms of the resources and thoughts devoted to it. One of the findings of this current study, that the review that the government is engaged in, shows that there's a fairly pronounced disconnect between the government and industry on FTAs. The industry is not entirely, but primarily of the view that FTAs unleash a deluge of imports and that are damaging for their interests. Whereas the government has been arguing, and probably with the right findings, that imports are actually coming in through the MFN route, because if you're not using the FTAs, then where's the question of their increasing imports? So there is a fundamental disconnect somewhere. The RCEP negotiations are the first occasion where industry consultations have started happening. And hopefully this will become more fruitful and constructive over time so that the sort of the chasm and the point is that we probably now, it's high time. We have been in the WTO for 20 years. We have been at the GATT earlier. We have seen the rest of the world. We consider ourselves as a very important economic and strategic actor in the world. But if we really think we are important, we must start thinking like important players. And one of the basic issues when it comes to negotiating trade is the fact that matters like trade and investment are not separable issues. In fact, today, the whole context of value chains, the whole context of forward-looking agendas has repeatedly explained that investments go in first and trade follows later. It is actually investments that are generating exports for a large number of occasions, for a large number of producers. So there's no point in separating trade negotiations from investment negotiations. There's no point in one ministry looking at bilateral investment treaties and another ministry looking at regional trade agreements when one has to necessarily be a complement to the other. So to an extent, this is a structural gap, and this needs to be addressed. So I'll just stop here. Thank you so much.
I would like to bring about perspectives of the industry, and as I see it from the policy analyst side, and see it from the vantage point of basically the trade and industry bodies, the captains of industry, grappling with the policy framers. So I have very little stakes, I must say. I'm just watching, and I must say with all humility that I'm watching without any stakes involved. So I'm not a stakeholder in the real sense. The second important point I would like to make is the word free. I've been told as a student of economics, it never exists, always a cost. So the free trade agreement is, don't get caught by the term that something is free. It's always going to be a cost. What is the cost? What is that you will bring onto the table? It's very nice, you know, after the, I would say actually this proliferation of regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, all these things started after the collapse of WTO, or I would say the stalling of WTO post Doha round. So the Commerce Ministry had to reinvent, it had to find out a reason it had to exist. So chalo, let us go out and see whether we can sign with West Africa. 3 agreements I am told agree with Sri Lanka. So let us do something, you know. This is like Shivji ka Bharat. Everybody has to do something, so jump up and down, do something. So everybody is happy that we are doing something. So there is some activity, but at the end of the day, there is nothing. So this is one important point that we have to understand between the multilateral trade agreements, which was the basis of our WTO negotiations, and this free trade. Frankly, not much of leveraging has happened in the way it should have happened. Trade is a very important diplomatic weapon. Today, India has to emerge in the Committee of Nations, the role that it has to play. It cannot be reduced to a simple tariff and issues relating to customs duties, or trying to even say that I have a few NTB, non-tariff barriers. It has to be much wider and look into whether a particular FTA fits into the overall scheme of India emerging as a as whatever she wants to, as a destination, as a global player, or as what we call as economic powerhouse, whatever it is. Having said that, I must say that always, now we say that we are 1.5% of trade totally in the world as a percentage to global trade. We are just 1.5%. China is 11%. On the scale, China's current trade surplus is equal to, or more or less equal to, our exports. What it means is something mind-boggling. You know, China gets around close to $275 to $300 billion as trade surplus, and our exports is 300, 320, and we have seen this, that we will improve this 20%, and at the end of the day we end up with doing 2%. So something phenomenally is lacking in our understanding of this issue. The most important issue is what do we bring as the core competitiveness to the table. If we want, I have seen one of those which happened, and I was there, this Thailand early harvest scheme. We had some 86 or 80 odd products where we said that if there will be zero rate of duty between both countries, that if you are so confident of importing zero rate of duty from Thailand, we also added a clause, as you very rightly said, 30%, 40% of value addition must happen in Thailand. If 30-40% of value addition is happening in Thailand and you have to bring a product, something terribly was lacking in that group which was suggesting this particular rate of value addition. So somewhere we are not sure where we are figuring in the competitiveness. What is our core strength? Somewhere down the line we do not know. Yes, we will export this. We will not export this. Probably we have this in the gray area. We don't have a clear scheme of things, either within the industry. I'm not blaming the policy framers in the Udyog Bhavan. That's the second part. But even within the industry, I don't see very many people. We have been, advising. My friend is here from FIO. He knows me. We are into advising some leather groups also. Tell them that at the end of the day, they say so many things about not penetrating, say, the entire East, right from Japan to Vietnam, to Bangladesh to Cambodia. They come with various reasons. Partly, all of them are right. In the sense, as I said, I'm not a stakeholder. I'm only putting them in a cogent manner. But what I find is, there is no one place, for instance, I can say that these are the non-tariff barriers faced by the shoe industry or the leather industry, say with Japan. We don't have that even today. In fact, my initiation into WTO studies was by Mr. Gurumurthy. And when he asked me a very important question, do you know what is WTO? I said, sir, I don't know. And that time I was a chartered accountant. I was 5 or 8 years into practice. So he asked me a second question, do you have this WTO book? I said, I don't have it. He said, you are also amongst one of the several policy framers in this country who have signed this WTO agreement without reading it. So you better start reading it. That's how I started reading this WTO agreement. The point I'm trying to make is, we still don't know why we should enter into FTA, what is that we should give, what is that we should take. That, unfortunately, and I would say that the blame does not lie in this case. I'm a very ardent critic of the government. But on this I will say that by and large, industry has been failing. In fact, in Madras Chamber, we have been trying, we also tried once to see whether we could prepare a list of non-tariff barriers faced by exporters. Nobody was coming forward, in the sense, either they were reluctant, or they felt that this was not much of an importance, or they felt that this all, this all too will pass, and over a period of time we will somehow or the other manage it. But somewhere down the line we don't seem to have it. Next one, I think, having said all these things, are we playing the correct game? Because Raghuram Rajan has raised a very important point. This request, just because it doesn't fit into the scheme of things of the Prime Minister, which is Make in India, he has asked a very important question, whether this is a viable, durable policy. Are we in a position with 142? I think we are ranked 142 in the global scheme of things in ease of doing business. I said at 142, it can't be ease of doing business. It has to be unease of doing business. So you have to relook it from the other side and say unease of doing business, we are ranked very high. So if that be the case, what are you going to make in India? And if, unless you make in India, you are not going to export out of India. And I always tell my friends in Madras Chamber, after the New Companies Act, probably these are the very few occasions we will be meeting in these type of halls and discussing things. We would perhaps be discussing all these things. We will be inviting you, sir, to the Pural jail, where we will be conducting these type, because this Companies Act is so obnoxious that you do anything, you are inside the jail. You don't do anything, you are inside the jail. So we will have to, these type of laws on one hand, and you also say futuristically we will try to, merge with ASEAN, Japan, Mercosur, BIMSTEC. All this is fine. But the reality of it is GST, as we are talking last week, we had a very impressive meeting in the Madras Chamber. And the most important thing is not to get goods from Thailand or Japan. To get it from Andhra into Chennai and from Chennai to Andhra is a challenge in this country. So let us understand, where are we? Let us get rooted onto fundamentals. That here is a country where getting something from Japan, from your port, if my friend Mr. Krishnan can get my consignment from the port, it's a big success. Not that I'm going to do anything out of the way, absolutely legal. And every time you have to get your product out from the port, it is like a lady giving birth to a child, punarjanma. Sometimes these type of things, nobody understands that we are facing such huge challenges on a day-to-day basis. So to say that we will have to escalate to a level of doing things, all this is fine. But we are still finding that as an exception. They are doing despite the system, not because of the system. That is the important point. Most important thing, people in Tirupur are making something, people in Ranipet are making something. They are not making it because the government wanted it, or the government's plan thought that, okay, we must promote textiles, or we must promote leather, or we must promote software, or we must do this, or we must do that. It is all because that it happened despite the best efforts of the government. And I'm not saying anything pejorative, because the government doesn't have any clear understanding of what is happening in, say, Tirupur or Ranipet. They may be having some vague view that somebody is making garments there or shoe there. It's such a big country, we don't have, and let us take even statistics about trade. I do a lot of dumping work. The biggest challenge is to say that authentic data about what has happened in the last 12 months. We will get of March 2014, somewhere in the period March 2015. By the time so much water has flown through the Ganges that nobody is really worried whether you are injured and whether the dumping has caused the injury. It's very difficult as a practitioner of that law with no current statistic. You don't have, DGCIS is not on a real-time basis. And there is a fellow in Bombay giving you real-time basis, which is a private limited company, which has now been elevated to a status of the authentic statistic provider of the government of India. Nothing can be more liberalized than this in this government. Okay, but finally let me conclude by joining all the dots. Trade is important. We have to do this. We have to get into the global arena. In fact, as late as 1870, statistics by Madison's report suggest that we were as high as 25% of global trade and global GDP. The GDP increase and the export increase, or the trade, India's percentage of share in global trade will also increase. That's no doubt about it. So it cannot be that your GDP will not increase or export will increase or vice versa. Both has to show a concomitant increase. But if both have to show a concomitant increase, this suddenly my Prime Minister goes to Philippines and says, oh, Philippine-India FTA. Then we say, oh, we have gone to Japan and say, we will do this, but they say, no, come through the ASEAN. Oh, Philippines will also be brought into the ASEAN. This type of ad hocism which has been going on, which I am not, there may be a method in the madness, but I see madness, but I don't see a method. So first the government must come out with a paper or a position paper, why it is doing all these things, what is its objective, where all they are trying to actually figure that they will put the where they feel India's competitiveness lies. And finally, India's competitiveness lies in leather, vague things, textiles. We are very good in software. No, it is like an 8th standard student writing in half-baked composition. We don't know what we are, competitive at. So we have to have a clear picture that these are the 3-4 areas which we will be competitive, period. If we are good in automobile accessories, let us say, yes, we are good in automobile accessories, do what it takes to do automobile accessories. But we will vaguely start doing it, then we will have these factories, then no power, then idiotic labor laws, then finally say that we have driven those fellows out. And when Indians are not investing, the only benchmark I have, that where we will get the investment and really economy starts ticking, when we stop investing in gold. Gold, we are importing $5 billion a month. That means $60 billion, which means Indians are investing abroad. It's a good benchmark. It may not be a benchmark for the economist, but a benchmark for a financial guy, that you are investing $60 billion of money from our hard-earned sources outside India. Now, if you are investing outside India, why should others come into India and invest when you are not investing in India? Why is that money not going to fund productive, important investments? The reason for it are hundreds. We have talked about it. That's why we are 142. Now, how do we improve it? Billion-dollar question, not the subject for today's discussion. But unless we improve it, we cannot say we are going to be on the table offering something important. We are just going to be there and having our cup of tea, probably samosa, and coming back home and say, yes, we have signed one more FTA, and as you said, there will be so much of tariff lines which are irrelevant. We have signed so much of FTA on which we don't have nothing to offer. We don't have anything much to offer, and likewise, they will also not have anything to offer, except that the joint secretaries have made a visit to all these places and come back. And people have to go, and this, as I said, Shivdi ke Bharat, that people have to go, people have to come, you have to run a commerce ministry, and the commerce ministry has to show that they have done something, put it on the website. Unfortunately, unless the mindset changes, that one of conquering, one of complete delivery, both from the industry and from the ministry side, and we should probably emulate something like the Japanese have the MITI, which talks about handholding, a very close cooperative idea, where the Japanese have definitely held it as some sort of idea that they will push across the industry with very clear, and what about your currency? And most of these countries in the ASEAN region have found the way to economic nirvana through exports. And export nirvana is through undervaluation of your currency. Now, are we ready to debate undervaluation or revaluing or downvaluing our currency? Are we ready to do that? If we do that, what will be the consequences? There are a profound number of questions simply because we have some, this Microsoft Word can go on printing, copy from other FTAs, add, twist, and do some tinkering here and there and say, hey, presto, you have one more agreement with some more country. Not going to take us forward. Industry has to be more proactive. I'm sure Madras School has a lot of role to play because some of these are not even chronicled properly. We don't even know the impact studies. If you can do some impact studies, and I'm sure in the presence of my president, I can assure you, we can participate. We're not very sure about the outcome, but at least 1 or 2 impact studies about 1 or 2 products, about what has happened. We would be very happy to, we will know where we stand in the sense, have we benefited, have we lost out? If we are lost out also, there's no problem. We can rework and redesign the whole thing. But we don't know whether we have gained or lost. We are like, Alice in Blunderland. We do not know where are we. So with this, I will stop and hope that when we meet next time, we will have far more actual hardcore facts to discuss. Thank you.
Greetings to Dr. Amithendu Palit, Mr. Venkatesh, and thank Mrs. Yai for giving us this opportunity to present what we believe. Thank you for giving us this opportunity for letting us know what is the industry perspective. But I would not like to dilute the flavor that Mr. Venkatesh and the conceptual framework that you have already left here. So we'll purely talk about our industry and how we look into it and what are the challenges that we are facing in not being able to avail it, or what are the further support that we require. I think that is one of the perspectives that you may help us through when we fail through. I think just before we start, I'll just quickly give you all a view of what Ashok Leyland is, very quickly. I think it's a transnational conglomerate, part of the Hinduja group. It has got business interest across several verticals. We have presence in 35 countries worldwide and more. We have more than 65,000 employees. I'm talking of the group per se. We have turnover of several $billion, and Ashok Leyland being the flagship of this Hinduja group, located head office in Chennai. Our own turnover is close to $3 billion. This year we have seen the worst recession, and therefore we are $2.5 billion. Am I right, Raghavendra? Yeah, normally we touch around $3.2 billion. But that's about it. This is the kind of landscape that the group is involved in: banking, hospitality, healthcare, into British metal, technology, real estate, media, and so on and so forth. I think it's quite a diverse group. And our business is to transport people and goods all across India and the globe as far as possible. That's about, I think we'll skip this. This company was founded 64 years ago in 1948. It's just we're celebrating our 64 years now. I think we'll skip this. Yeah. Critically, one of the data that we'd like to share, in terms of vehicles, transportation, the industry has grown up to 6.5 times if you take the last one decade, from 479,000 to over 3 lakh vehicles. And we have the breakup of these vehicles also. The revenue in terms of our exports out of India has grown to 7.2 times in the last one decade. Does it give us a real comfort? I think no, because the share of Indian export in terms of the vehicle export is still only 2.5% in the last one decade. But the opportunity is significantly high because we are a very capital intensive exporter. You know, each of our vehicles would cost you around $50,000-$60,000. So any number of increase in the vehicle significantly impacts this figure. So I think there's a lot of work to do, and that's why one of the slides showed the potential for exports is much higher. This is the data, of course, with the CM. But a lot of changes happening in India. Like you said, India is being considered by many people as a strong hub. They do see value, and I don't need to reiterate this. The presence of Hyundai, companies like Toyotas, and people coming in are ample proof that India is being seen as an attractive destination, as being one of the low cost, producer of goods. But what does it take us to? Now there is a clear shift in exports from developed regions like EU to developing regions like Africa, ASEAN, and Latin. I think Doctor spoke about it very briefly. What we see is that our exports to Europe has significantly dropped, whereas there is a significant increase in our exports to Africa, Latin America, North America, and ASEAN. What is worrying is that we have lost significant ground in SAARC as well, where we had a very strong presence. I think you have touched upon some of the points, and this is a cause for our worry. And the same is also with the automotive industry. And FTAs do help us in some cases and don't help us in some cases. Doctor has very rightly elaborated the causes of unequality, the concept of confusion that is prevailing, which FTAs to be used and which FTAs not to be used, significantly contribute to this. Yep. I think of late the Commerce Ministry does understand that there is a lot of vague symptoms in the way these FTAs are being designed. I think they are now saying that the countries, there needs to be focus in the countries where India can do better, India can progress well, rather than having FTAs signed all over the places, RTAs signed all over the places. This is one of the clip we heard our Commerce Minister, Honorable Commerce Minister, speaking about that this FTAs and RTAs need to be more country specific, where India's potential or capability to deliver goods is much higher. And we as an industry see this as a positive sign. Of course, I deviate from what you say because it helps us. Some of the strong competitions in export market, proximity and free trade, is Africa, where Africa and European Union, where China and used cars from Japan are strongly prevalent. Latin America has the same symptoms. ASEAN has the same symptoms. SAARC also has the same symptoms. And we obviously talk of tariff and non-tariff barriers all the time. We find that the FTAs by competing countries resulting in tariff disadvantages as high as 105%. Especially in ASEAN, we have seen this, I think it's ASEAN and Mercosur. It has come up to 105% is the difference. I would say that the FTAs help, but then the clear definition is something that is missing, whether it is FTA to be used FTAs or RTAs to be used, FTAs with Thailand to be used, or FTAs with Philippines to be used. These are the kind of confusion that we go through, resulting in this 105% of this tariff barrier which stares us on our face all the time. And it's not easy, because there's a rule where you can say that local production, rules of origin, and to do a local production is not that easy, because it's an art by itself to do an assembly, and especially when you're talking of something like a vehicle, high capital intensive product. So it's a long drawn process that we also need to learn and evolve. But FTAs definitely help, but if we have the clarity, right clarity. We have, I think Mr. Venkatesh talked about a lot of bottlenecks, and these are significantly impacting all of us in the industry. And there is a cascading impact of local taxes you talked about. We'll give you some example. There are serious problems with our port infrastructures. We have serious problems with the delay in custom clearance and procedures. We have multiplicity of export incentives and related procedural. So what is happening is this is nullifying the net effect that we are trying to bring in through an FTA. So when you have one-sided trying to focus on FTAs, right, you rightly said there are other areas that we don't focus, and therefore the good work that is being tried to do there, it falls apart. So this is what is happening. I'll try and give you some examples, quickly run through it. Of course, these are the vehicle export figures. I don't think we should spend time on this one. It basically shows that there's a huge potential for India. India's share in Africa is slightly growing, 7.6%. Here we are 1.8% in the Latin America. In the ASEAN, we are 2.2%, very poorly placed, whereas the potential is very high. In the SAARC, India's figure is 28.1%, but it has come down from 36%, which is a significant reason of concern. We'll run this through. The internal issues that I think you also talked about is we have cascading impact of taxes, and that comes to around 6.7%. And this affects our cost, because when you export, these are a part of our cost. And then we have octroi, we have electricity duty, we have customs duty, we have other taxes such on freight paid and things like that. And the total effect is 10.9%. So imagine where we are trying to save 105%, we are already adding 10%, 10.9% to 11% in our own industry here. So one of the things is that while you look at FTAs, there are other impending, barriers that we face internally. Even with the GST, a significant part of this will remain unaddressed. This is one of our concern, I think, as an industry. The other bottlenecks is that, the port clearances, the terminal handling, the ICDs, the documentation in the port, all this leads to delays. And there's a cost that we have calculated which are incurred due to these delays. Can you just show the cost? Yeah, just run to the cost. Yeah, if you see this, the cost that happens because of these delays is 0.82% for the inventory holding cost, and we are taking an average value. In a time when the capital goods which are of higher value, this cost goes up from 0.82% to, of course, sometimes up to 2% also. Now this is very significant. We have done our own internal case studies. Every day we face this. This is not something that we have data. Every day we face this. There is a demurrage due to delay is 0.6%. Approach road transport cost is 0.13%. And if you go on, this figure comes to 2% to 3%. And again, we are adding 3% to our cost. So while you try to save duties and blame people for not giving us access, we have internally created a lot of bottlenecks. We have other problems like, the port infrastructure not being adequate, so Ro-Ro vessels not calling to port of our liking. Like there are goods which you could ship out of Kakinada, or you could ship out of Mundra, or you could ship out of Chennai, but we don't have these facilities where the big vessels comes and take it. It is only restrictive. So these are some of the impending problems that the industry has. Sri Lankan ports are continuously coming under private control and mostly from the Chinese side. This is going to be a major concern despite the FTAs and the RTAs that we have in Sri Lanka, and also which needs to be ratified. I think Doctor can elaborate on that a little bit more later. Therefore, without taking much time, what we are trying to say that while we look at the FTAs from one side of it, we definitely need certain FTAs to help India grow, to help our industry grow, to give us those access to the markets. But then they need to be more comprehensively done. The clarity of understanding on those FTAs should be extremely clear, that where is the industry heading to, how will the industry benefit out of these FTAs and RTAs. So clearly there is a tariff disadvantage of 25% to 40% likely to emerge vis-a-vis competing countries in all potential markets of Africa, Latin America, ASEAN and SAARC. This is on an average value. There is a coherent trade strategy by way of FTAs with key market is needed to address this tariff disadvantage. But I think Professor has addressed this more elaborately, that it is not just about tariff. This more comprehensive service needs to be covered under this. We need to look at FTAs where really India will believe to be strong enough, where the capability of delivery is going to be much higher, rather than spread FTAs and be everywhere in the world, like Professor had shown that 17 FTAs signed all across, but really we don't know where we are going with these FTAs. So we need to be more focused on the FTAs where India can really perform. And one of the areas is either you look at the countries where India can perform better, or you can look at the core competent product where India can perform better. And these are the areas where we need to look at the FTAs more strongly. While India has given free access for automobile to these countries, we have not reciprocal tariff concession. I think this is one of the lacuna. Fortunately for us, many of the SAARC countries have no automotive industry, so really has not impacted us. But with the Chinese industry coming in strongly in all those countries, very likely whatever stronghold we have in this country is likely to be impacted as well there. The current rate of duty drawback is ranging between 2% to 2.85%, which is highly inadequate, and this is on account of the 10.9% cost that we add up, and also the 2% inventory delay cost that we add up. So this is actually not adequate, where we incur actually 14 to 15% of the cost, but the incentives that we get is only around 2.85% is the max. The DEPB benefit of 7.5% are very low compared to the cost of the logistics that we incur because of inadequacy of our ports and the systems. There is an embedded taxes and duties suffered by the automobiles could be as high as 10.9%, which I have already talked about. So while the current drawback rate compensates only the custom duties suffered on components which are imported or raw materials, it is highly adequate to address total amount of duties and taxes suffered by export vehicles. So therefore, duty drawback rate needs to be enhanced, and why I am bringing this up is possibly some of the suggestions might go around and hit the ears of those who make decisions, and therefore I brought it to this forum is that duty drawback rate to be enhanced to a minimum of 10% to offset the cascading effect of 10.9% of the cost that we have seen already. So this will also save the auto industry from the cost buildup, because cost buildup is a huge concern, because we have one side of, we are sure metal work, our vehicles are built with metal, rubber, aluminum, and these are the things every day, the trade index and the market index are talking about, the aluminum goes up, metal goes up, and our industry is the most vulnerable. Even if the rubber industry goes up, willingly or unwillingly, I have to raise my vehicle price, because there is like 4 to 5% of the cost which is coming out of rubber in my product. There is 65% of that which comes from steel. There is 33% which comes from different kinds of steel, and then aluminum. So any small impact on the metal industry impacts us significantly, and we don't have a breather for that at all. On the government side, I think there is no significant movement happening. We had this Exim Bank's NEIS schemes which were supporting exporters also to go into the countries where FTAs are there, but these OEMs and these lines of credits have not been adequate, very, very poorly managed. Like you rightly said, they announce a lines of credit, and by the time you go and avail it, we find that the lines of credit have changed. They don't exist. We have some brilliant cases where Exim has given us approval for projects worth $300 million. And when we went to execute it, they said, no, the ministry has now, new government is in place and the ministry is asking us to change it. Please wait. So we waited for 2 months to find out that the interest from 1.25% has increased to 4.25%, thereby making it extremely difficult for those importing countries to accept my goods, because they are all signed under the IMF treaty where they cannot create sovereign debt. And any composition of interest where LIBOR plus beyond 2% is considered to be a sovereign debt. So now when Exim Bank of India changes its interest rate from 2% to 4.2% just because a new government is in place, creates this kind of a difficulty that despite the FTAs you still can't go there. There was a 2% subvention which I just talked about. I just touched upon this 500 million this thing. This corpus for the NEIO, which is one of the good schemes that Government of India did for the exporters, and it was not just automobiles, it was just for all project exports. It could be leather, it could be any project, it could be any services. This has been multiplied to 20 times of the original cap. But then the problem is that they have also raised the interest rates, and because of that nobody is able to utilize that effectively. And there should be critical lines in those countries where India has signed FTAs. Instead of giving lines of credit all across the globe, Exim could redirect its credit lines to those countries where India has signed FTAs, thereby making it easier for the industries to avail the FTAs as well as the credit line. I mean, this should synchronize. It doesn't synchronize in our cases. India gives some credit line where there is no FTA. So this is one of the recommendations that we have been making time and again, that the credit lines needs to be synchronized with the countries where we have RTAs and FTAs in place. Just change. Of course, the post-import infrastructure and Indian customs system is something which is to go a long way. Even in Africa, which is supposed to be the most unorganized nations, have better facilities, have better infrastructure, have better knowledge. I could take it from me. I have worked 15 years there, and I have found that their knowledge in port handling, their caliber in port handling and discharge is much better than India, in many of the best ports that we see in India. I can give you an example. We have some 200 buses in the port for the last 15 days. We have already incurred demurrages of worth $1 million. So, you know, when you try to make money, you actually lost money before you even shipped it out. So, what we also suggest that the increase in commercial engagement with local governments through commercial attaches, which are like today defunct. We have commercial attaches, but they are mostly engaged in, you know, Republic Day and Independence Day functions. I think they should get most actively involved in understanding and explaining to the Indian industry how it works vis-a-vis those countries. We had a discussion today morning and we find that in some of the countries, the laws of import have changed. And by the time you do your due diligence and want to go there, you find that the laws have changed. And the Indian attaches, when you ask them, they said, no, we are not a part of this, but we are a part of the FTA. Now, FTA also tells us the rules of origin. FTA also tells us the laws that prevails in that country. So you cannot have a system which abdicates and says, I am not a part of this, but I am only a part of this. So there's a very strong need for the government agencies to engage in the countries where we have FTAs. This is grossly missing. This is what we feel as an industry. And it's very important as a growing economy that the government of India, through its bankers, Exim Bank, has a presence in those countries where FTAs are really supposed to be very effective. And one of them is Latin America and ASEAN, of course. All these above countries are automobile hubs, which levy high duties on automobile imports into their country. This is a big barrier for us. Even though we are capable, our products are good. Doctor, I can assure you that our qualities has improved much beyond what you would know 5 to 10 years ago. We really produce world-class goods, but they are all capable of going there. But then suitable FTAs, suitable clarity on FTAs can definitely take us there. We have no doubts in our mind. Because the reason I'm saying is that when you have this tariff barrier, and when you look at a localized assembly, it's not easy to go and set up a local assembly because there's a huge amount of knowledge in terms of a local infrastructure which is required. It takes years of time to do this because any plant in India itself is conceived and developed in at least 4 to 5 years time. And when you do this in a foreign land, it would at least take double the time. So by that time, I think we will still be lagging. But these are the issues that I think as a government and as an industry needs to be addressed at some point of time if we need to clearly take advantage of the FTAs and the RTAs are prevailing. Is that all? That's about it. I think that's about it from the industry perspective. Thank you all for listening to me. Thank you.
Interesting. Very interesting, very different points of view. We're going to throw it up for questions at this stage, and please keep your questions short. I'll have a couple of my colleagues pass around the mics. Anybody who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. The usual suspect. Yeah, please. It'll request the...
Dr. Palit and MRV, it's addressed to both of you. See, when you're talking of a free trade agreement with ASEAN, what we fail to understand is the ASEAN cooperation is complementary, not competing. When we are signing a free trade agreement with a group of countries that are complementing each other, we are invaded on many fronts on which we have little or no defense. Fundamentally, our approach to a grouping of nations which complement needs to be understood before a free trade can be really looked at and studied. What's your reaction to this?
I think if my presentation is understood in minus the rhetoric,
you will agree with me that we are not prepared in most counts. This rushing to sign and repenting in leisure is our traditional genetic hallmark. So we must, as you said, why we should enter into an FTA with X country, what is that we get on the table, what we should put on the table. Forget what we get on the table, what we have to put on the table, we don't know. We always have a defensive positions in most of this, and we are not clear what should be our offensive position. And at best, we try to say that, you know, our software engineers are not allowed into those countries, you know, visa relaxation. We don't understand that it's not as simple as these, and we are ready to open your rice market, and our rice market is opening for trading, you know, software engineer. No, this is too puerile an approach to this particular complex situation. Case by case, we are not prepared. My grouse is both the industry and the government. And I'm blaming the industry again and again here in this point, that they are not prepared for an all-round escalation into the global arena. That's the point I'm making.
I think I'll put it this way. I mean, much as I think what has repeatedly come out over here in what we have discussed is the fact that obviously an articulation of the trade policy and how it should be exercised with respect to engagements is missing, is very much missing. In the specific ASEAN context, I think I would like to share with you that the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, which is an agreement between the ASEAN themselves, is the least utilized by the ASEAN members themselves. So there's obviously a generic issue with the FTAs, which is not a problem only with India. It could be more with India, but it is by itself a generic issue which needs to be addressed. And one of the points to be noted over there is that ASEAN by itself is extremely heterogeneous. So when India is negotiating with a heterogeneous group of economies, I mean, India cannot say that split ASEAN into 7 blocks and I'll negotiate each of them bilaterally. The US, by the way, has a strategic leverage of doing that, and it has done exactly that in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Eventually, the Trans-Pacific Partnership has come down to bilateral discussions between US and those members of the agreement with whom the US does not have bilateral FTAs. Now, India could have been pragmatic in looking at these ASEAN discussions in the context of the fact that it already has an FTA concluded with Singapore. It's about to conclude one with Malaysia. So what else? You utilize what is left before you to the best of your advantage. Unfortunately, that thinking, I mean, you and I might think that thinking hasn't happened. There are others who might think it has happened. We'll leave it there. But this is probably the sequence and the priority which is missing. And to an extent, one feels that it's a waste of negotiating effort. I mean, it's gone on for 5.5 years, and at the end of it, what do you end up with? That's the whole point. You know, there are countries across the world, including emerging markets, and maybe I'll start from the developed country examples. Countries like Australia and Canada have what you call the divisions of foreign and trade taken together, like organizations like the DFAT, for example, in both countries, foreign affairs and trade taken together. Because I think just to resonate on a point which Mr. Venkatesh mentioned, at the end of the day, trade does have a strategic component to it. And this is an unmistakable part of a bilateral or a regional relationship. So if foreign ministry thinks in a particular way, commerce ministry thinks in another way, and finance ministry thinks in a third way, and with 3 arms have little knowledge about where they are moving and in which direction, that what are you going to end up with is obviously something which is not satisfactory for either. But when it comes to a later question, that it in terms of reviewing the practices and the partnerships, I think the problem with India has been that in many cases, India has been drawn into agreements in a somewhat unwilling fashion. This could have been avoided. Let's say, for example, the RCEP negotiations. Whether there was a strategic pressure on India to get into the RCEP negotiations or not is not known. But there would have been regional issues. Let's say, for example, if India had thought that not getting into these negotiations would give a country like China an upper hand by being a part of that negotiations and getting greater access into the regional markets, then that's India's loss. I mean, this could have been one way of rationalizing the entry. The other way of rationalizing the entry could be to think of India playing a bigger role in the Asia-Pacific region, eventually having the APEC on its mind. But whatever be the proximate cause, whatever be the date of dominance, this is clearly not an excuse for not having a well-thought-out policy. And I think that's where the biggest challenge for India, and I agree with both of my co-panelists on the fact that an enormous amount of work is left to be done when it comes to improving the business conditions and sort of in turn improving competitiveness. The fact of the matter is that trade policy eventually today now is domestic policy. I mean, trade policy engagement is basically an outcome of domestic policy reforms. So that has to be taken in totality. If you mentioned whether any review has been done or not. If you look at the feasibility studies, they're all in public domain that have been done for different FTAs. You will find the feasibility studies only referring to certain tariff lines. If they are taken away, what is the impact? Not a single feasibility study that I have seen today done on any FTA has ever taken into consideration the fact that if Indian investors invest in Philippines, what kind of benefits can that produce? Not a single FTA has ever looked into the nature of the rules of origin existing there. Not a single feasibility study has ever noted the fact that you cannot carry apples into Australia or nuts into New Zealand. Now, I think this is also a problem with the approach with which these subjects are addressed. It's an entire tariff focus and a narrow coverage and a sentiment attached with a few lines, which is either an academic sentiment or a professional sentiment. Trade is much more than all this. Tourism is a huge part of trade, and not a single feasibility study has ever focused on tourism.
I just wanted to add something to your question. And substantiate what Doctor has said. Just to give you an example, there's actually a greater need for the government to engage much proactively. I don't know, it could be through the chambers of commerce, it could be through the CII or any of its impending bodies, but there's a very good need to understand the industry perspective and explain to them what would happen if things opens up a little bit. Just to give you an example, in the year 2004, I think 4 or 5, I was a part of the Commerce Ministry delegation visiting Bangladesh and discussing free trade agreement between Bangladesh and things so forth. I think it was Honorable Mr. Jairam Ramesh at that time. And we talked about a battery manufacturer from Bangladesh coming to India and trying to sell. And there was a huge objection from Exide India, saying that, if they come, they will be dumping and things like that. And eventually, I think they allowed this trade to happen. And then Exide was the one who was benefited the most. It was only that the knowledge dissipation, that when you open it up, when you do this free trade, the sharing of the knowledge from the government side did not happen properly. And therefore, this dragged on for 5 years before this was opened up. And finally, when it was opened up, it was Exide India which was benefited the most. So I think there's a closer need for government to explain to the industry how these FTAs work, what are the impacts, the positive impacts of the FTAs that can happen to the industry. Also, specific goods. We have trailers from Sri Lanka coming to India now, but then we have double the trailers going back to Sri Lanka. I think this was one of the things that was never highlighted, never explored. So that's I wanted to add to what he said.
Has presumably 2 sides, India and another country. And since we have signed some 16 agreements, which are the foreign countries which have taken, let us say, advantage of that agreement? I mean, from whatever is discussed, it appears India has not taken the advantage. But surely the other countries would have also done some homework. And they might have taken advantage of the vast Indian market. Who has increased their exports to India? Is there any statistics?
Sir, from the other country perspective, the request to India is always to lower tariffs, because the reason for that is that Indian tariffs are on an average around 17% higher at the time of starting negotiations vis-a-vis the partner countries. You'd hardly find any partner country which has applied tariffs. We are not talking about the bound levels, but the applied tariffs, which at the time of beginning negotiations across the board. There would be specific sectors where the negotiating countries would have much, much higher tariffs, but there are across the board calculations show that Indian tariffs at the point of beginning negotiations for most FTAs have been around 17% higher than the partner country. So the pressure on India is to bring down these tariffs. And let's say, for example, if from 20% on an article, India brings this down to 8%. The room for leverage for India is extremely limited, because India would be arguing that from 5% you bring this down to 4%, whereas in India's case it's a 20% to 8% drop. So obviously the degree of preferential access obtained following the FTA is much more for the other country. And to that extent they would be using those tariff lines that they have extensively. But there have been interesting occasions, and again here I come back to the story of the investment. Let's say, like Mr. Rijit referred to the issue of OEMs in the automobile sector. Original equipment manufacturers and assemblers like Hyundai or Toyota, they in fact have been active users of the ASEAN FTA that India has, because they are assembling in India and exporting to third country markets, but they are importing the components from their various facilities located in Southeast Asia. So for them, it's an FTA which has worked to their advantage. So there are obviously several other chains that sort of, come in to plug the story, and there are sectors which require advantages of a different nature when they're negotiating the FTA. The entire dynamic changes if you look at it from the point of view of specific industries, like pharma, for example. I mean, for pharma, the whole FTA dynamic can be very different vis-a-vis that of automobiles, or even from the point of view of services. For a country like India, which is large and complex and several industries, it's obviously not easy to have a cogent, holistic policy. But nonetheless, what is possible is to define overall forward-looking interests.
Thing will be the Chinese exports into India. Without any FTA, we are running what for the last 4 years, 2013, 2009, 2010, 11, 12, 13. We had an import of around close to $175 billion. And what is that we have imported? No, not anything which is high-tech, not any weaponry, not anything which is not made in India, or not that is possibly that could be made in India. So obviously, entering with an FTA with China is okay, but you will be probably entering in those tariff lines on which these exports happen, or do not happen rather, or you will be creating a harakiri. It's going to be a big challenge to do something with China.
And I'm pretty much not sure about the question, but I'm a very young student of economics. Right now, I'm writing my thesis. The name is a market valuation of carbon, bridging European and Indian emission trading system. So I was just wondering, when we consider the commodities like carbon and, as you rightly said, gold as well, so should I also consider the free trade agreements? And I mean, how do I figure this free trade agreements in the free market, like commodity market in the world which doesn't need any free trade agreements in real sense? I mean, in technical sense. So I was just wondering to get some suggestions on that. Like, how do I manage with free market in commodity sectors like carbon and gold with FTA?
Well, honestly, I don't find any direct connection in a contextual sense, because FTAs typically, I mean, gold is a very different commodity altogether, but when it comes to carbon trading, I think it has a completely separate, exclusive, structured market and system of its own. And Obviously, carbon trading is not a part of the FTA negotiations the way we know it. In fact, WTO by itself does not have any space for the carbon trading construct. Having said that, there's probably only one area where there could be a connected relevance to this. That is, there are trade agreements which are increasingly looking into the relationship between trade and environment. But till now, FTAs which have handled this have actually focused on trade of commodities or movements of people which in any way have an impact on the host country environments or ecology in any way. So beyond that, unfortunately to my knowledge, I am not aware of any additional relevance that FTAs the way we know can have structurally for carbon trading.
For normal people, not for crooks. So what you're asking is, there will be crooks and there will be people who will be taking, under-invoicing, over-importing. This has been there since the days of Adam. So we don't have to really worry about it. What is happening is, these type of trades, these type of agreements is for honest businessmen who wants to do it the most simple way and productive way. So there will be people, and believe me, there will be people who will also, the FTA is not the only route. There can be 100 different ways. Why you use, in fact, India's investment, outbound foreign investment is around $100 billion the last 10 years. And none of this has gone to any of these FTA destinations. It has gone to Mauritius, Cayman Islands and others, of which we are getting 1%, less than 1% return. Obviously, these are all kickbacks paid to somebody else. So you know, I know about it. These are part of the system. So we have to work around this. We cannot always find a solution. You know, perfection is a myth. Let us not work on for perfection. Let us improve things.
So those were, carbon trading was something that I didn't think would appear, but that was covered as well. Interesting. Before we sum up, I think, incidentally, we also have here with us Dr. S. Narayan, who's in town. We're so lucky. Who was formerly Finance Secretary, Government of India, was Economic Advisor to the Prime Minister. So we'll be so grateful if you could just share your point of view on the matter. And given that you're here with us, I think just the honor of listening to you talk about this subject. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Actually, we've had three, I would call it very brilliant presentations, brilliant talks. And one from the government point of view on the negotiation strategies and the lack of strategies. One from the public point of view looking at the mixed messages that all these negotiations are having with the public. And others from the industry point of view looking at the kind of gaps and kind of lack of implementation that these policies are having. I think all these are extremely important and relevant and point out to the fact that certainly these negotiations have to be done better, more professionally and more focused. But I will take one step back and say, I think a fundamental question, and I will now talk at a slightly larger picture. The fundamental question we have to answer in 2014, which was not a relevant question in 1970, not a relevant question up to 1980, is that do we need global trade? So long as we are a major energy importing country with 70% energy coming in from overseas, so long as we are a major gold importing country, because gold imports personal consumer behavior you cannot change in a generation, so long as we are major coal importing country, we are going to be importing close to 500 million tons of coal in another 5 to 6 years' time. That cannot be avoided if you want the lights to burn. We have to trade. And it is high time that we realize now that the sooner we get into trade, because otherwise we will not be able to buy. The stock markets and the financial markets will not give us enough leverage to buy the basic things like petrol, gas, coal, fuel, electricity, and gold. So there is the priority for improving trade is much more important now, and which is why, please look at what the present government is saying. Why are they saying make in India, make in India? Why are they inviting people to come over and invest in India? It is because, one, can we replace those kind of goods which we are importing, like Christmas trees and lights and vinagars made in China, etc. Can we replace those at least? Can we only import things where we require technology, where we have technological gaps? Why is defense being pushed to local manufacture? Because can we not make rifles? Can we not make parachutes? Can we not make, I would say, jackets which are bulletproof jackets in India? Can we not go to that direction? And can we focus only on imports of those which we cannot do about? And that is essentially the Make in India campaign. And therefore, can we negotiate with the international world to say, okay, I am going to get myself up to speed in making those things which I am importing now. If you want to participate in that development, come and do the FDI, which is what somebody said. Investment and trade go hand in hand. Come forward and invest, make it in India. If you make money, if you look at the balance sheet of all the foreign companies that have invested even in Chennai, you will find that the outflows have been far, far, far greater than the inflows. They have benefited. There's nothing wrong with that. But they have provided employment, they have provided technology, they have provided logistics, they have provided subsidiary employment, etc. So I think it is very important for us to relook at this paradigm from an India context and say, can we get over, if I may be, if you permit me, I would say the problems which have been raised here are all process-oriented problems. There's a problem in process of negotiation. There's a difficulty in process of understanding why this is happening. There's a difficulty in process of converting this into action at the ports, etc. Can we get over this process-oriented problems and go next step into a strategy-oriented solution to say, okay, we have no choice. We have to get this happening. We have to get this happening in the next 5 to 10 years. And how can we make this happen? And there I think government as well as the industry has a role to play. I will go along with saying that I have not seen a cohesion in industry, the point raised by you, sir, about what exactly is wanted. I mean, I have sat in seats where on different days, different sections of industry come, please go ahead with the ASEAN agreement so long as you don't include my sector into it. I'm very happy about it. All right? This comes again and again. So is it possible for one voice? And today, even the Ministry of Industrial Policy is coming up and saying, giving the same list that Mr. Venkatesh talked about. What have we benefited? We have not benefited at all. And we have not benefited because we have listened to so many voices of different sectors of industry saying, leave me out, do it for the other. So can we look at, again somebody here talked about this, what is our core competency and core strengths, and say, okay, this is what I'm going to make and sell outside. And I think this is possible. So I think somewhere a cohesive, coordinated effort between industry and government to have a dialogue to say, okay, what are the 10 or 20 sectors where I want these things to happen? And where I want to import. I want zero tariffs on coal. Okay. I want zero tariffs on gas. I want zero tariffs on maybe urea. And then go out and negotiate because that is of benefit to us. So I think the shift in dialogue, the shift in thinking has to change, and that has to change with academics. Basically, it's a problem of data. Information is lacking. Information, as he correctly said, of even what are the non-tariff barriers is not available. I've been suggesting to Deepa and Vijay that, this is an information which they can actually put together and even sell because it's not available, just not available. So I think information gaps, data gaps, and really strategy cohesion gaps are what we need to address. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. We also have a business model input for fiscal year 2015. Thank you so very much. And I'm so glad. This was a bit of a coincidence. I'm so glad we also had Dr. Narayan here with us today. It's been absolutely scintillating. Right at the outset, Dr. Amitendra Palit, thank you so very much, for having come here from Singapore. And Chennai is not necessarily a destination that people come by. It's not necessary. It's something that it so happens that Singapore is perhaps one country that Chennai acts as a transit to. So thank you so very much for having accepted our request to come and participate today at the discussion and to share your point of view. It's been absolutely fantastic listening to you. Mr. Venkatesh, I must say it was scintillating again. You also have a reputation for being a fairly interesting speaker, and I think this is the first time I'm listening to you, and I must say the reputation, it does bear itself out quite well. It was absolutely fantastic. Mr. Chowdhury, I think the details really, are only obvious. I mean, you can only articulate the details well when you're running a business and you know what it really takes. And I think that perspective came out brilliantly. Thank you so very much. Thank you all so very much for your points of view. It was fantastic. Thank you. A very big thank you to the Madras Chamber for having partnered with us today, to the Madras School of Economics for having provided us with the venue. Thank you, Mr. Shanmugam, the director, and all the other members of the institution who've been so very supportive. And last but of course, never the least, thank you all so very much for really taking the first working day off in the new year to be here with us. I hope you found the discussions interesting. Like I said, this is really just a part of a larger series that we at Athena Infonomics are going to be doing. We'll keep you all posted. Those of you who are interested to want to be a part of this, please leave your email IDs with my colleague Arihant Barmecha there. We will write to you and tell you about the upcoming events and keep you posted. Thank you all so very much. Have a great year ahead.